Good evening. Welcome to Lead Library. Thank you for coming this evening, negotiating the Mountain West Conference tournament and parking. Exactly. And we're so disappointed that UNLV is not playing anymore. But as Marty said, there's always next year, or we've said there's always next year. So UNLV, we might become those Cubby fans. So there's always hope. So tonight is Inspiring the Present, Bringing History to Life. If we haven't met, my name is Maggie Farrell. I'm your Dean of Libraries here at UNLV. Tonight's discussion is part of our celebration of the 50th anniversary of Special Collections and Archives. Special Collections and Archives is committed to collecting and preserving the history of Las Vegas and Southern Nevada. These efforts enable us to host events such as this one tonight, where we can discuss what makes our city, our region, so unique and such a wonderful place to call home. We're so glad that many of you have come to Lead Library tonight. There are a number of new faces in the room, and we welcome you to campus. And for those of you who have attended our other events, thank you for coming back and joining us this evening. I want to thank our panelists tonight, and we'll hear more about our panelists in just a minute. But before I get started, I do want to recognize some of our guests this evening. The libraries are privileged to work with a group of individuals who assist us in our advocacy and our development efforts. They are the library's advisory board. And tonight, as I call your name, if you don't mind standing up, I won't embarrass you too long. So Marty Blond, Jen Lewis is here, Jim Frey, Jim is here tonight, and Katie Crockett. Would you join me in giving them a round of applause? Thank you. They do great volunteer work for the UNLV libraries, and I appreciate you coming tonight and the work that you do on behalf of the university and the libraries. Another special guest just getting off the plane, Michelle Light. Michelle is our Director of Special Collections and Archives. Michelle, would you please stand? Thank you. It is due to Michelle's leadership that we are celebrating 50 great years. And Michelle, thank you so very much for making it part of your travel plans to be here tonight with us. Dennis McBride, I haven't said hello to Dennis. Dennis, are you here tonight? There's Dennis. Sorry, Dennis is the director of the Nevada State Museum, a great partner with us in preserving our local history. So please join me in welcoming Dennis. Now, there are a lot of the individuals in the libraries who work on not only making our special collections accessible, but they work with students, they create our digital presence, they enable our collections. So if you work for the libraries, would you please stand, because I want to recognize your hard work. Come on, Michael, I see you over there. Come on, Sean's over here. There's some more in the back. Thank you very much. Tonight, if you have a chance, you may have heard about our Built exhibit. It pulls our photography from our Building Las Vegas initiative to document the built environment of Las Vegas. It is located on the first floor, so if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to take a look. Aaron Mays is here this evening. He has captured some fantastic images that showcase the diversity of our city's neighborhoods and communities. And Aaron is here if you have any questions about that exhibit. In addition, on this floor, on the third floor, if you go all the way around, Next to Special Collections, we have the Unbuilt Las Vegas. This is Imagining Failed Dreams exhibits. And what it does is it shows some of the buildings that weren't built here in Las Vegas. So there's some fantastic designs that, I'm sorry, we never got to see, but it's just around the corner. It's curated by Peter Michel. The exhibit highlights the number of proposals created by Las Vegas architects. So if you have a chance to see that, please do avail yourself of that. Lastly, one more commercial. We have one final event in the series celebrating our anniversary. It will be on Friday, April 6th, same time, same place, different topic, but we hope that you will join us. We have a program that will feature the Barrick Museum of Art, the Lee Business School, and Harrah's Hospitality College, because all three of us are celebrating our 50th anniversary. So it will be fun to look back on 50 years and look forward to what the next 50 years will be. So seating is limited. If you're able to join us, please do RSVP, and there's more information in your program. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Sue Kim Chung. She is head of Special Collections and Archives Public Services. Sue Kim is our moderator this evening, and I'm sure it will be a fun and lively discussion. So Sue Kim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Farrell, and welcome to everybody tonight. It's so exciting to see such a full room of people gathered on a Friday night in Las Vegas, when you think about it, to engage with the panel on history. So I think it says a lot about our panelists that we've got such a full room tonight. So I just wanted to ask, how many in the audience are first-time visitors to the UNLV libraries or UNLV Special Collections? Great. I'm so glad that you have joined us. And so for those of you who don't know us, and this might be a little bit of repetition, but hopefully we'll get this in your brain. But this year marks 50 years of UNLV Library Special Collections and Archives collecting, preserving, and describing the history of Las Vegas, Southern Nevada, gaming, and UNLV. From books to photographs, from maps to magazines, from architectural drawings to costume designs, from oral histories to show programs, and much, much more, our collections tell the rich and varied story of Las Vegas history from both a community and tourist perspective and how they overlap. So for our 50th anniversary, we came up with the slogan, preserve the past, inspire the present, and impact the future, as a means to sort of eloquently and compactly sum up our mission. And so tonight's program is based on the second part of that slogan, inspire the present, as it considers how these three gentlemen do just that by bringing history to life in their varied careers. So let me introduce them. I know most of you might already know them, but I want to give them their full introduction that they deserve. So to my left is Tom Hawley, a UNLV alumnus, Nevada Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. He is most known to us for his traffic reporting and for his innovative Video Vault segment that features stories on Las Vegas history drawn from the video archives of Channel 3. Then we have our own Michael Green, UNLV Associate Professor of History, also a UNLV alumnus, Las Vegas history commentator, Board of Directors of the Mob Museum, author of KNPR's Nevada Yesterdays, which are read by former Senator Richard Bryan. He's also the author of several books on Lincoln, Nevada, and Las Vegas, most notably a co-authored book with Gene Mooring, Las Vegas, A Centennial History, and the most recent textbook history of the state, of our state, Nevada, History of the Silver State. And last but not least, we have our colleague Jeff Schumacher, who's currently the content director of the Mob Museum. But prior to this, he was a reporter for the Las Vegas Sun, editor of Las Vegas City Life, Las Vegas Mercury, and a columnist for Las Vegas Review-Journal. He's also the author of Sun, Sin, and Suburbia, An Essential History of Modern Las Vegas, Howard Hughes' Power, Paranoia, and Palace Intrigue, and Nevada, 150 Years in the Silver State. So I want to welcome our wonderful panelists, and I'm really excited that they're going to sit here and we just thought we'd have a chat about something they are really fond of, and lots of us are too, Las Vegas history. I also forgot to mention, Michael, that you were also a reporter for the Valley Times. So really that is something that all journalists here. So I wanted to ask all of them a question about how they got interested in history and Las Vegas history specifically.
I'll start, and actually, I sort of got a seed planted more than 3 decades ago when I was going to school at UNLV, and I had no particular interest in history, but it was a required class at the time, so I took a large lecture hall class with Dr. Eugene Mooring, and I was just fascinated by how interested he was in the subject, and he would give this lecture hall class to 100 people or so, and he was so passionate about it, and he was reading extemporaneously, and he was excited about it, and it got me interested in a class that I had not been interested, that I was just taking as a requirement, and so I got very interested in it, and then a couple of decades later, when I was working at Channel 3, and I kept seeing all these archives, these thousands and thousands of tapes dating back to 1980 with film canisters from before that, and started dipping into there and finding that it just was very interesting, and that led to gathering information from other places. But it really started here at UNLV with Dr. Eugene Mooring.
Okay, I'm next. I wanted to say, note before I mention this, Sue Kim, I noticed you didn't mention where I went to college. Well, I went to University of Nevada, Reno. Don't hurt me. But my first year I went to UNLV, and Tom and I crossed paths at that time. He was working at the radio station, as I recall, and I was at the newspaper. So had a little experience with UNLV. My interest in Las Vegas history and Nevada history really started when I was working as a journalist here in Las Vegas at the Review Journal, The Sun. And I found myself being more interested in the stories we were covering. I was more interested in what happened before than what happened that day. In other words, you're supposed to tell everybody what's happening today in tomorrow's newspaper. And I started looking back in the library and the archive and what we called the morgue, and spending more time back there looking at the past than I was looking at what was happening today. And that led to a book about the history of Las Vegas because it was derived at that time not so much from the Special Collections Department as from the Las Vegas Review Journal's archive of articles and papers and so forth, most of which, by the way, still have not been properly preserved, but we'll get to that.
Well, I guess I'm with both of them, coming out of a journalistic interest in what had gone on before. Like Tom, I had Gene Mooring, not for Nevada history, I'll get to that part, but also working at the Valley Times, where I was working there the night a call came in that Frank Rosenthal's car had been blown up. And our editor ran out and covered it. I didn't. And I think about this because my interest in local history may date back to my father being fired by Frank Rosenthal from his job as a dealer, so it was very important to note that he had an alibi that evening. And I was working as a reporter when I took a survey of U.S. history at UNLV from Ralph Roski, who did a lot of Las Vegas and Nevada history. And there was a course on the books that he never taught while I was here, history of Southern Nevada, but he encouraged me to get into the archives. He knew there was a lot there to be covered. And so that got me into special collections and my involvement with local history. And Sue Kim mentioned doing Lincoln, Nevada, and Las Vegas, and someone once said, how do you connect the three? Well, when was Nevada made a state? It's Battle-born. I wore my Tom Hawley Friday necktie.
And socks.
Battle-born socks. But I did not think I would end up coming back here after getting my PhD, but I got a job at the community college before I finished the PhD and was writing local history. So I was kind of not born into it, but raised in it.
So, Mike, you've mentioned a little bit about Ralph Roski, and so for those of you who might not know who Ralph Roski is, well, as we noted, Special Collections is celebrating 50 years, and Ralph Roski was sort of instrumental in helping us get an oral history collection here, and also Anna Dean Kepper was one of the very first pioneers of Las Vegas and Southern Nevada history. So can you tell us a little bit about those early days, or what about Ralph and Anna Dean, if you remember her?
I unfortunately did not know Anna Dean. When I was going into Special Collections, I was encountering the two Lizzes, Warren and Patrick, who with Anna Dean I think would be the Three Musketeers. Ralph Roski had come here in 1967, 50 years. This was the 50th anniversary. And I adored Ralph Roski, but he had, as unfortunately I may, a penchant for embellishing. But he swears that early in the days of Special Collections, he walked in one day and Celeste Lowe said, "Ralph, did I lend you the signed first edition of Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins' Life Among the Paiutes?" And he said, "No." And she said, "I wonder who I lent it to." Things have cleaned up a lot. Anna Dean Kepper was a great collector and advocate of history and preservation. The Mormon fort would not be there if not for her. A lot of the collections in Special Collections up until her death, I guess in 1983, would not have been there without Anna Dean. And Ralph Roski taught the Nevada History Survey. And by the time I took him, he wasn't doing this assignment, which was probably for the best. There were probably a lot of annoyed people out there from it. But Anna Dean Kepper talked to him about oral history, so he sent students out to do interviews. And a first-year student is not necessarily going to do a great job doing an oral history. As Clay T. White is here and will tell you, it's tough. But they were at least getting these people on tape. And so there are people who you would not otherwise have been able to hear speak who are on the tapes. And the other day somebody was telling me that Roski went to one of the interviews, and somebody said, is the tape on, is the recorder on? And Roski thought it was off. And he said, no, and the guy proceeded to tell him stuff he should not have on tape. Then Roski said, well, let's put the tape on, and it's quiet for a second. They said, so? And then he asked the question, thinking, I'm not even telling him.
So we're really fortunate to have that collection of those early oral histories, and we've recently been able to digitize them to preserve them for future researchers. So I wanted to ask the guys, what kinds of things have you researched in Special Collections and Archives over the years? And I know also, Jeff, was there anything that you might have researched on your recent master's degree in history that you were doing some work on?
Yeah, so probably the piece that I've spent the most time on in Special Collections is Howard Hughes. So it's a really great a collection there that I haven't really even tapped into fully yet. Peter Michel put together a whole curated thing online that's just astonishing. And so, you know, I've done a book on Howard Hughes already, but I'm doing a new version of that, a new edition of that, working on that this summer, and I suspect I'm going to be coming in and spending some time with that Hughes collection in a way that I did not the first time around. And what this collection is it's all of the, it was Dick Hanna was a publicist for Hughes, and he kept, you know, voluminous records of the time that he was working for Hughes. And so one of his jobs, though, was to, you know, and of course most publicists don't do this, right? But what Dick Hanna's job was to do was to try to manipulate the reporters to write stories in such a way as to make Howard Hughes look quite favorable. And he often was successful, as the records show, that he would negotiate with reporters, and he would finagle, and he would, you know, argue, and he would do everything he could to try to, you know, bring out Howard Hughes in the best light. Earlier on, before he became a recluse, Hughes actually did this himself. And he would be talking directly with reporters about, well, I think you ought to change these words, you know, this set paragraph, and you ought to do this and that. And it's just really insightful into who Howard Hughes was and his great concern about how he was perceived publicly. So I did a lot of work in that area. And then just more recently, in doing some more academic type work, I did a lot of research on the history of water in Las Vegas. And I have to admit, I can't really cite the different collections from which I mean, it's written down somewhere, but I kind of just like searched all over special collections and found astonishingly great things about the history of water development in Las Vegas. And there's only one piece of that that's missing, and I have to go back and do more work on, and it's why I haven't submitted this paper to anywhere yet. But there was this great belief in the first half of the 20th century in Las Vegas that Las Vegas had this untapped, this unquenchable, if you will, water supply. That we can let the taps flow, we can let the springs run because it's never going to run dry. And there's some sort of myth making, there's some kind of mythology that was the basis for that. There might be somebody in this room who knows the answer, but I could not find that answer. So that's one of those holy grails I need to come up with before I can submit this paper.
So Tom, I know you've done so many different pieces over the years and researched them. So can you tell us about a few of those?
Well, and as you mentioned, I have all these tapes available to me at Channel 3. So that's where I started at, is just with all these thousands and thousands of tapes. But in going through those, I would find often I would need supplemental things. And then after a while, I started doing stories which we didn't necessarily have video for. And I just get a story idea for something that maybe took place before 1980, which is when our collection starts. And so I'd start looking around for photographs to support the story. And one thing I like about special collections is that they've got a great online index so that you can get online and know what's in the collection. I would probably spend more time down here, except geographically it's not that good for me. I work in the north part of the valley, but you can surf a lot of things online, and so that's why I can find out what is in the collection before I actually want to access it, find if there's something worthwhile to do there or not. And a lot of my stuff that has made use of special collections is sometimes secondhand. That is to say, sometimes I'll do a story which is based on a book which someone has written, which has been researched primarily here, like a story that Larry Gregg did about Bugsy Siegel, where he did a lot of the research here. Also a book by David Schwartz about Jay Sarno, where he did a lot of the research here, and some other books. And so I'll take these books, and they've already been researched in their book, and I'll try and figure out a way to turn them into a 2.5 minute piece of TV. And sometimes it won't come out exactly the same. Or one other thing about special collections is that I would notice some exhibits come up here, and I would see the news release about an exhibit, and I think, well, that might be a peg to do a story about. And after a while, special collections became aware of this, and so sometimes contacts me and lets me know that here's something that you might be interested in. And usually they are correct. And so right now, for example, I'm working on something that will air in a couple of weeks about that built exhibit that was just mentioned, or the unbuilt exhibit, which is up here on the 3rd floor. And so to do that, it's sort of my story is not going to be the same story that you see in the hallways here on the 3rd floor, but I use that as a way to find out what sort of supplementary video is going to support it, to turn it into a story that'll talk about this, but it'll also make use of the video that's available to me. So I sort of combine what I have in back at the TV station with what I can find at special collections and the other outlets that are available here, because there are a number of outlets, including the Las Vegas News Bureau and the Mob Museum, the Neon Museum. There's a lot of places to dig up research around Las Vegas.
And once upon a time, there wasn't. You had the State Museum at Lorenzi Park at the time, and you had special collections. And now I'm more likely to walk in there and say, oh, I'm working on such and such, I need to look at this one thing. Or I'm going to check an index. The Valley Times Index is in there. And the stories I've written is, my God. Student came out when they said, I was reading something you wrote. I said, too bad. But I can remember starting there as a student and looking into things about early Las Vegas, going back to the beginning, things I had done on the early Jewish community, on feuding between the RJ and the Sun. Believe it or not, it's not just the last few years. And I think back to burrowing through the Pop Squires collection, which I think is collection number 2, if I remember correctly. Which is, of course, Pop Squire's version of history, which is not necessarily what happened, but it still it gives you a lot of leads, and that's part of what happens. You're researching in special collections, and then you say, oh, this leads me here, I'll look at this. It might send you to the microfilm, it might send you to the phone. But I think I've probably left fingerprints on a lot of things in special collections.
So is there an event or a person or a building that you think is largely unknown that you've uncovered and would like to do more research on in the future?
I'll mention one because it's, to me, the most intriguing character who I've come across, and I don't know if it's a dead end at this point, but I want to find out more, and that's the Cave Lady of Sunrise Mountain. And this is someone who I'd heard about, who for a long time I thought was a myth. I thought was an urban legend, a woman who lived in a cave at the base of Frenchman's Mountain back in around 1965 or so. And then I found out that I heard from a couple of people who insisted it was true, and I went through the index and I found some newspaper articles that indeed mentioned this woman, and I made a little story out of that, and I thought it was pretty interesting. And then out of nowhere, a few years later, this woman contacted me, and she had these recordings. They were audio recordings that this woman made about her mission to live. It was some sort of religious mission to live in this cave at the base of Frenchman Mountain. And the things that she says, she's a very interesting character with sort of an Eastern patrician accent, and we don't know anything else about her other than what's in the newspaper and what's in the recordings. Now, there's quite a bit in the recordings, but I want to find out more about her. And so we've already got a fair amount to go on, but that's an area I'd like to find out more, the Cave Lady of Sunrise Mountain.
I'll do two. I was doing a history of the Jewish community in the early 20th century and came upon the name A. Levy. A. Then suddenly we see Adolf. Okay. Now maybe it's Levy. He was not apparently related to Harry and Al, the later generation. But here's a guy who invested in a bunch of different things in Las Vegas, and he barely showed up in print. He lived here part of the time, then he was back in Los Angeles. But as an example, finding things about him in the papers and special collections, and then sort of branching out into, well, what's in the Age and what's elsewhere. And I didn't even know if he was Jewish. The name could be, but not necessarily. And I found his obituary, and it said he was buried in a cemetery in Whittier. And I called the cemetery, and I said, "Are you a Jewish cemetery?" They said, "Yes." I said, "Could anybody sneak in?" I think the poor woman who took the call wishes she hadn't. And she said, no, nobody sneaks in. And I told her the story. She got a lot of information for me that included material that contradicted what was in the 1910 census about Levy. Whether Levy's family was wrong, I don't know. But it would be interesting to know, here's this early pioneer businessman who's sort of in and out, and we don't know a lot about him. The other goes back to when I was a student, and I read a book about Las Vegas. It was Las Vegas Playtown, USA, which is in special collections, Catherine Best and Catherine Hillier. And they refer to the R.J. and Son having a feud, and it became one of the first things I published, and it was about Hank Greenspun against the R.J. Well, John Kalin's a prominent name, as a great collection at Dennis McBride's place, did a lot for local history. His brother Al ran the paper and was the big political activist. So when I was doing this, I asked to look at Al's papers, which were in special collections, and I think it was 22 boxes. And they were all scrapbooks of his columns, which was very annoying. There were also some letters back and forth with Frank Crow. Okay, that's good. But what was he up to? Well, he was actually up to a lot based on what people have told me. But your telling me that may not mean I can prove it, or we can prove it. So I'd like to know more about him, and I can't. And some of what I've been told, I can't print.
Well, I sort of think about, now that I work at the Mob Museum, a lot of my attention is focused on the history of organized crime in Las Vegas and law enforcement and its efforts to combat organized crime. And, one of the great problems we face at the Mob Museum is that the mob didn't keep notes. They didn't have any file folders full of their secrets. And once in a while, something interesting might come up in a court case, and that's always a great resource, or an FBI file. But aside from that, one of the sort of things we'd really want, and we'd put it we'd probably run it as a mural if we could find it. So this is where, if anybody's looking for a research project, a picture of, aforementioned Bugsy Siegel in Las Vegas. In other words, there's all kinds of pictures of him in Los Angeles. There are police mugshots of him in New York City. If anyone could find a picture of him in Las Vegas, we would be very interested in that. There is in the farthest regions of the internet, there is a video that shows Bugsy Siegel among a group of people in the early 40s in Las Vegas in front of the El Rancho. This is on some kind of a site in Europe that I have no idea how to get in touch with these people. I've tried repeatedly to get in touch with them to say, we want that video. But that's a really odd thing if you think about it. One of the iconic moments in Las Vegas history was the opening of the Flamingo Hotel on December 26, 1946 on the Las Vegas Strip. Basically no pictures of that event with Bugsy Siegel in them. Or any others for that matter. And this goes back to maybe John Kalin and some kind of agreement not to take pictures.
Yeah, there was a memo put on the RJ bulletin board. He will not be referred to as Bugsy Siegel. It is Benjamin or Mr. Ben Siegel. But when the Mob Museum was starting, and this is the kind of problem that you do run into, with Las Vegas history being so recent in so many ways, and the telephone and personal interactions being so important. But when the museum was being started, someone asked me, what are you looking for? And I said, well, if you can find a piece of paper that says, to the boys, from Meyer, Ray, Bugsy. Okay, kill him. Great. It isn't there. And in the next week, 3 different people called to tell me who killed Bugsy Siegel. And it was 3 different people. I know Larry Gregg has his theory. Everybody has a theory. I don't think he was killed. I think it's a fake.
Not killed at all.
It's a fake.
I had a story about the murder of Bugsy Siegel, and the story was killed by my boss at the time, Bob Stoldahl, who's a local noted historian, because he looked it over, and there's so many theories about who killed Bugsy Siegel. This one, and I wanted to couch it in terms, this is what this guy says, it's his opinion, but there's a lot of opinions out there and no facts. That nothing that's ever going to, or to this moment, has solved the case.
Just to put a bow on that story, we did a program at the Mob Museum about the murder of Bugsy Siegel. We had 3 different experts on stage, and we ended up with 9 plausible theories. So at this point, we're at 9. I'm at like 6. I think I can rule out 3, but that still leaves 6.
And I'm going to give you the one nobody mentions. Murder on the Orient Express.
Now we have 10.
There's a 10.
So can you tell us a little bit about maybe if your favorite era or a character in Las Vegas history, and possibly something in special collections that's given you insight into that era or that character?
I'll take one at that, just because we were all spent a lot of time growing up in Las Vegas, but my father was a showroom musician here, and so I remember vividly the 1970s down on the Las Vegas Strip and sort of going behind the scenes and down the corridors behind, and it's just a really fun, fond memories. And so when Janice McKay, UNLV professor here, wrote a book a couple of years ago about the lives of showroom musicians. As a matter of fact, my dad was one of the people who was interviewed for the book there. It just evokes such fond memories of that era, and she drew also on a lot of the photographs that were available here and memories of people who, and a number of the people, including my father, passed away within a few months of the book being published. So it's sort of a bygone era, and so it's important for these publications and stories to be around, just to capture that stuff as the people are no longer with us.
She also looked at the fabulous Las Vegas magazines, of which we have quite a large run of. So that was another source.
And that's also, I know that was one of the things, what's an important resource to talk about. One really important resource that I think some of those are available here and also in people's attics and basements around town is all these old magazines and things like Vegas Visitor and Panorama. And I just wish we could get all of those out of attics before they find their way to the landfills.
Well, it's like asking to pick who's your favorite child. But I think about the late 50s, early 60s, the civil rights era. And one of the people who has gotten so little attention in all of this was the Reverend Donald Clark. And one of the reasons he got so little attention is that he did not want to talk about it. Yet there are Donald Clark papers in special collections that I looked at, and I got some perspective on him. And it was interesting that in the movement, for example, a lot of the African American civil rights leaders were Democrats. They made sure there were some Republicans in there so they could work with both sides. Don Clark was one of them. And another thing was they organized a boycott of one of the dairies because the dairies then had the milk delivery drivers and would not hire a black delivery man. And Donald Clark was hired as the delivery man. He's a minister and he's a delivery man. And you think about the people who built a movement here, and there is a wealth of information about them, and a wealth that is missing, of course, that we can't get at. I'm with Tom. Go into your attics. Go into your basements. Go into the corners. Pull it all out. Bring it to Sue Kim.
Well, and just on that point, I mean, and recognize, and this is something that as historians we I think neglect sometimes, that history doesn't have to be something that your great-grandparents had. It's something that happened in 1992 or 2002. As long as you can sort of recognize that it's going to have significance 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. So in writing my book on Sunset and Suburbia, it was focused on the 1990s in Las Vegas, and so I had the great fortune of being able to interview people who were there and so forth. But when I did the Howard Hughes book, as you mentioned, like 3 of the people who were my main sources died like months after the book came out. And so I was incredibly fortunate to have had that opportunity to interview those folks, thus the value of oral histories. As far as, not to go into the organized crime too much, but probably my favorite character or most interesting character that I want to get a better handle on is a guy named Johnny Roselli, who spent a lot of time in Las Vegas in the 50s and the Las Vegas 60s, and then in Las Vegas in the 1950s and 60s, and who was really instrumental in Howard Hughes buying all of these casinos that he bought in the late 60s, and made money on each one of them, and later had a gift shop at the Tropicana that he made a bundle on, and who was involved with, being sort of the liaison in all these different kinds of interactions that, kind of the behind-the-scenes guy who didn't keep notes. But he's an incredibly interesting and important character, I think, that we want to do more on at the museum. And so if you know somebody...
And I believe I interviewed you about Roselli at one point. So, and I'm trying to remember because this was a couple of years ago now, but if I remember right, Roselli, among other things, was the model loosely based, and I don't know how much of this is known or how much is just conjectured, for the horse head in the bed scene with a Hollywood. That is to say, putting pressure on a Hollywood mogul to make a decision to cast someone. Not necessarily with a horse, not the horse head in the bed, but just making pressure known.
And
Right.
the Mob Museum has a display on Ralph Lamb. And I guess the story is one time Roselli was supposed to tell Ralph he was in town and didn't. And you're supposed to report to Ralph Lamb when you're in town. And Ralph Lamb went down to, was it the DI coffee shop, and literally pulled him across the table by his necktie, hauled him down and had him deloused. My grandfather, the policeman, fully would have appreciated that story, but maybe not me.
So we know that sometimes when you go into research something, you have something in mind that you're looking for, but can you tell us about anything that you discovered in the course of research that was unexpected and was actually more interesting than maybe what you were expecting?
One of my favorite stories that I've done was completely unexpected, out of the blue. And I don't even remember what story I was looking for, but I remember I was going through some videotape from 1981. And so I was looking through the story, fast-forwarding through it, and then something zipped by, and I rewound and looked at it again. I said, I wonder if that is... And it was I just looked at the picture, and it showed a plane in a pond on a golf course. And I thought, wasn't there something like that in the movie Casino? And there was. For anyone who's seen the movie Casino, there's a scene where a plane lands on a golf course because it's doing surveillance. So in that story, back in 1981, our reporter interviewed a boy who had seen it happen. And so this 10-year-old boy who had seen it happen. Unlike most of those stories, the boy's name is mentioned, David Goldwater. I thought, I wonder if I can find him. And I found him, and it turned out he had become an assemblyman and now is a lobbyist for the state of Nevada. And I found David Goldwater, and so I had 1981 David Goldwater, and I had 2014 David Goldwater telling the same story in the same way with the movie Casino in between with portions of it cut in. And it turned out to be a delightful story, and I really hadn't planned on doing it at all.
It's not so much that it happened in special collections, but it happened because of special collections, that I was researching the newspaper war of the 50s. And I thought, well, Hank Greenspun's around. I should try. And so I spent a lot of time in special collections preparing, reading a lot of papers and looking at the microfilm in the microfilm area, and finally went down and interviewed Greenspun. And it's still one of my favorite moments, because what would happen in the morning, the Sun would come out, in the afternoon, the RJ came out. It was the Evening Review Journal. And Greenspun would do a column calling Al Kalin everything you can think of and some things you can't. And when I interviewed Greenspun, I said, did you two ever talk? He said, oh, yeah. We talked all the time. I might get a story, he might get a story, and he'd call me and say, Hank, I heard such and such. Should we print this? Is this good? I mean, here are the two editors deciding whether they should print a story that might make Las Vegas look bad, which curls journalists' hair, frankly. But I said, well, did you ever talk to him after you'd really unloaded on him? And I will never forget the way Greenspun said, yeah. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, we'd be talking, and Al would say, Hank, now you know that was not true. And I said, well, what would you say? And he said, truth has many complexions, Al. Well, in special collections, I'm looking through the Kalin scrapbooks, and his column disappears from the RJ when Don Reynolds buys him out. It shows up again 4 years later when he becomes a columnist for the Las Vegas Sun and talks about how, oh, you would never have predicted this. But here I am.
So something does come to mind. When I was doing research on for the Sunset in Suburbia book, I was doing a chapter on transportation. So we're talking pretty contemporary history. So I wanted to do the story of the Beltway, by the way, which still isn't over, right? We're still building the Beltway today. It was supposed to be finished, according to my book, in 2017. So here we are. But I was over at this is not a special collection thing, although it makes me think this ought to be in special collections now. I was over at the Clark County Public Works Department interviewing the Marty Manning and the guys who were involved in the origins of the Beltway. And one of the guys, I forget his last name, Dennis, he says, wait a minute. And he leaves the office and he's gone for like 5 minutes. He went back to his office, he comes back, and he has this map. And it's dated 1964, and it is a sketch that one of his predecessors in Clark County Public Works had done of a beltway that could be built in Las Vegas. This was 1964 when the place was much, much smaller than it is today, certainly, or even when they started the beltway. And we're looking at it, and we're actually looking at it side by side with a map of the current Beltway, and it's eerily similar. But there's one difference, and you probably can guess. It actually went all the way around the valley. And by the time they started building the Beltway, it was going to be impossible to do that on the east side. But that's a really a nice relic that I mentioned in the book that I never expected to see.
You've kind of already mentioned this, Jeff, but you can mention something else, and because I think this is kind of a fun question. What is something you wish we had, or just in general in Las Vegas history evidence world, like a dream collection that we would have in a perfect world where people didn't throw away records or kept them in the first place? So.
Well, I have an answer to that, which is not a great answer, but it's a partial answer. Remember the Riviera closed, and not too long ago. And when the Riviera closed, there was, I think everybody was like, oh, they must have some amazing stuff at the Riviera, because Chicago Outfit ran that place for 20 years. There, you know, if you can dig back in the records, somehow you're going to find, you know, Johnny Roselli and all of these people who, and all of the evidence to show that what they were doing there. But no, and at least as far as I know, and because I went over to the hotel looking for that kind of thing, and they ultimately, there was contributions, and it looks like Sue Kim has something to say about this, but nothing that has to do, that I could find, having to do with the 50s and 60s at the Riviera. That would have been, I think, pretty cool.
Well, we did get a large donation of materials, but they typically, they're always usually from the entertainment department or
Exactly.
the PR department. So they're the kind of fluffy yet interesting, wonderful, fun entertainment side, which I love, but they're not the kind of stuff that you would love.
No
Jeff.
business records, no, you know, right.
How about you, Mike?
If he'd kept records, Mo Dalet's. Because you've got the Strip and you've got development. And I mean real records. There might be some things. But, and I'm sure his daughter, she has some material. But even then, how did the Desert Inn run? How did the Stardust run? And of course, what would be in those records might not be what actually happened. But allowing for that, think of Paradise Development and Mulaski and Adelson and building Maryland Parkway, essentially. All of the things that they were involved in for so long, it would be great to have that. And you could name almost, you were talking about the business records, any hotel. At the same time, the entertainment records are good, but there's a lot we don't have there. The entertainers themselves. And in some cases, just, well, who was paid what? And so on and so forth. And I can remember when the Harrah's collection came here and how exciting it was that now we have a major hotel corporation doing this. Well, how many of them go back far enough?
I would kind of like to marry my two areas of interest of traffic and local history, and I kind of wish there was more about public works things and projects from decades gone by. I mean, especially in the age of digital, everything is accessible now, but going back many decades, just street plans and blueprints that have been thrown away. And there's nothing that's more evidential about this than when there's a freeway project and it gets held up because the gas line is not where they thought it was, and they have to dig in somewhere else. And that happens all the time. And that's one thing that I've found really impressive and enjoyable about Eugene Mooring's book, Resort City in the Sun Belt, is that it has a lot of things about public works and infrastructure, which really is sort of key to making the city what it is today. And I know at one point I had some blueprints that someone down at City Public Works just said, look, we've got these hanging around. Do you want these? And I said, yes. And I got some blueprints that she gave me, including one of the sketching out how the Biltmore District was laid out just in the north of the downtown area. And then it was sitting in a bin over my desk, and someone cleaned up over the weekend. It's gone. And so my lesson there was to file those things away a little bit safer, that, make sure that, and I'm sure that a lot of things have been thrown out that are just trash in someone's eyes, but are actually valuable to people who are doing future research.
Well, nobody probably noticed the obituary, and you can joke all you want about the obituary columns. Yeah, I read them to see if I'm in. But there was an obituary the other day for a guy named Ed Fike. And longtime Las Vegans are, okay. Ed Fike was lieutenant governor in the late 60s, lost a Senate race to Alan Bible, lost the governor's race to Mike O'Callahan. And I worked for Bob Brown at the Valley Times, and Bob had been a political consultant before that. And after Bob died, it hit me, and I said to his widow, are there any papers? I'm a history major. I asked this. She said, oh, there were a few letters between him and Ed Fike, but I threw them out. And I cringed, and then I thought, no, maybe the world is better off. Now and then, we may not want to know. But, I mean, we do want to know. And you can talk about a prominent politician, but at the same time, call it the non-prominent person's papers, for lack of a better way to put it. They're important. We need them. We need to know about daily life.
So moving on to something a little more positive about something fun, but do you have a favorite item in special collections and archives? And maybe, we collect things, we have collections, so you may not necessarily focus on an individual item or photograph, but whatever, a photograph, a manuscript, map, anything in particular that kind of just be an individual photograph.
I'll mention one set of photographs in special collections I took advantage of a couple of years ago, and that was I was doing a story. I'm trying to remember what the impetus for the story was, but it was about the Three Kids Mine, which is this mine that was developed on the far east end of Henderson back in the very early days of Las Vegas. I think it started around 1914 or 1915, and it's still there today. There's I'm not quite sure where it's on a very expensive remediation project. But anyhow, I was doing this story about the development of it, and obviously most of its history took place long before there was any video. So I was kind of at a loss of what to show. And Special Collections just had a nice set of photographs that weren't from back in the 19. Well, there was actually one from back then. I'll get to that in a second. But also a bunch of photographs from, I believe, around 1970 or so, showing the state of it back then. But there's also one picture that I used in there that was a great photograph of a big trailer of manganese being carried right up Fremont Street and some kids behind it. And it's just a wonderful photograph showing it being taken into the train station in town.
One of the photos that ran through here was the Las Vegas Ranch by this time, painting from, I think, the 1870s.
The Dellenbaugh.
And I have a great love for that, partly because it's hard for a lot of people to believe that there was almost nobody here back then. And I got a call once from the then new editor of the Jewish Reporter. And it was through looking through special collections, by the way, this is a favorite moment, I forget whose collection it was, but it had to do with how many people read the Jewish Reporter and how many people in Las Vegas are Jewish. And they figured out, okay, they had 8,000 subscribers, and they decided, well, the average household's 2.5 people, so there were 20,000 Jewish people in Las Vegas. I don't know. And so then at one point, somebody said, well, there are something like 50,000 Jewish people in Las Vegas. And I happened to look, and the circulation of the Jewish Reporter was something like 20,000. And then somebody said, there are 100,000 Jewish people. Yeah, 40. They said, circulation's 40,000. And one day somebody said, how many Jews live in Las Vegas? I said, what's the circulation of the Jewish Reporter? We'll try to figure that out. So that's sort of a favorite. But the editor there called and said, I wondered if you could do an article on the early Jewish community, which is how I ended up researching Mr. Levy. And I said, oh, great. And she said, we've got some great photos of 19th century Las Vegas. And I said, his name was Solomon Carvalho. He came through here in the 1850s, and that's it. So I don't know who you're looking at. And so we had to go into the early 20th century. The other favorite, one is Fremont Street in front of the Northern Club, and the other is further down Fremont Street. They're both from the 30s, and they are my favorites because there is snow on the ground. And students will go, what? There's snow? Yes, children. We had a snow day when I was in junior high school. Yeah. And to be reminded that it isn't always 115 degrees.
And there's that film roll which Special Collections has, which is from 1930, 1930, which shows Fremont Street with about 6 inches of snow on it.
Yeah, the Wilson Park footage that we had in our 50 Treasures exhibit. Yes. And I was just going to ask Jeff, so it can be something that was a favorite of his for his own research, or it could be something that's a favorite that's in the Mob Museum, because we know that there's a lot of Special Collections photographs in that section on Las Vegas history.
Well, that's where I was going to go with it. I think not only in the Las Vegas area, but in other areas of our museum, I didn't go and count them today. I actually wanted to go count the number in the museum, but I didn't have time. But I think we have about 50 pictures from UNLV Special Collections on display in our museum. So obviously we're incredibly thankful and dependent on Special Collections. But now we're working on a renovation of our first floor in our basement, and we're adding more pictures, not all from the Special Collections, but Sue Kim helped me just the other day to find what is now my new favorite picture, which is a picture of Las Vegas Mayor Fred Hess in about 1930 or so, looking incredibly dashing, which is interesting considering he was the mayor, or maybe he was also a bootlegger at the same time. And he was actually acquitted of bootlegging, but he was accused of being in cahoots with James Ferguson, who was a certified bootlegger here in Las Vegas, and who Bob Stoldahl, you mentioned earlier, is doing a huge article on James Ferguson. But Fred Hess was supposedly his right-hand man in this whole bootlegging operation. So that's a great picture, and he looks like a guy right out of the Prohibition era. It's
And
perfect.
then there's a beautiful flapper in the picture with him, right? Isn't there? Is it the one with the girl in it?
I don't think so.
Oh, no. Oh, it's the one with the overcoat.
Yeah, maybe
the,
I missed
okay.
one.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe I need to go back and look at that. No, this is when the overcoat.
Oh, the
Yeah.
overcoat, okay.
By the way, I have to say that this is what Las Vegas is like. I'm at the gym one day, and the guy in the next treadmill said, "You do Las Vegas history, right?" Right. He said, "I had a great uncle who was important in Las Vegas history." I said, "Oh, who?" He said, "Fred Hess." "Oh, okay." And so immediately, I go, "Well, can you tell me?" "Nothing." None of us can find anything. So I told him Special Collections has this and that, and a photo of this and a photo of that. And the same thing happened with a descendant of William Bringhurst, who was a doctor here, who unfortunately died. But he and I were talking, and I said, "Oh, do you have any papers?" And he said, "No, we don't have anything about him. Can you find anything about him?"
So I just wanted to ask like one more question before I let the audience ask some questions. But what do you hope that we will collect in the future? What do you feel is essential to documenting the history of Las Vegas as we move forward into the 21st century?
Seems to me everything is that in this day and age, it's a lot easier to document things. The one thing I think that is most important now, I don't know that, I can't think of anything that's not being collected, but I think it's real important how it's collected. And Jeff had mentioned how the morgue at the RJ was not real organized. And my line about the archives at Channel 3 is that they are the worst in the city, except for those at 5, 8, and 13. So we're a little bit better than those, but they're terrible. But it just needs to be organized. And so one thing I like now is that I know that Special Collections is making a concerted effort, not just to get everything digitized, but also to make it accessible via the internet. So I can't think of what's not being collected. It's just how it's being collected that's important.
Let me just reiterate on the newspaper front that, and if there's anybody who knows something I don't know on this front, let me know. But as I understand it right now, the Sun and the RJ both have, well, I know they have extensive collections of photographs and of negatives and of documents, and not just news clips, that should be here sooner rather than later. Because especially at the Review Journal, there is a risk that those are going to disappear any moment of a change of ownership, change of management, change of anything.
Really, it's wide open if you think about it. And I'll go back to saying, the person who is not on everyone's lips, your family's histories, whatever. It should not just be, couldn't we get the Venetian paper? Wouldn't we love to have the records there? And of course.
You mean the Venetian restaurant?
Yes, the restaurant. With those great necks that they used to serve, yes. Oscar tells a great story about having a client named Nick Savella who liked to eat there and couldn't get into town because he was in the Black Book. But, you go down the list of major companies, that sort of thing. Yeah, fine. Politicians, fine. But the average Las Vegan who is possibly talking and writing about something that's going on in the community, I have buried in my filing cabinet letters when I was in grad school. My mother would write to me and summarize the news. Now, you don't really need that because there it is on the front pages of the RJ and Sun. But those kinds of things, I think we need to think of ourselves, not just the big names.
Okay, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience, and my colleague Aaron will come around with the microphone for you. Oh, looks like.
The other day we saw a news, I think it was in Tom's program, about James Ray Houston. Okay, so my question is, can you describe or relate some of your favorite colorful politicians, past and present, okay, in your mind?
Well, there was another guy who, and it's funny too. Just to sidebar a little bit, my sort of general rule of how old stories are acceptable is 20 years. It has to be at least 20 years to sort of qualify to appear. I'm a little bit flexible on that, but I find now it's important for people to keep another reason to preserve all history is I've been doing these history stories for about 10 years now, so there's a bunch of stories that I'll do now that I wouldn't have done when I was first starting. One of those was another guy who was a lot like James Ray Houston, and that's a man named Aaron Russo, who came to Nevada and wanted to be governor of Nevada, and he was just a brash, outspoken, he was a former movie producer, I believe. Now, he was not necessarily a con man like James Ray Houston was, but he was someone who was going to come from outside and basically run the state of Nevada, take it over. And he didn't fare any better. He didn't fare as badly in the long run as James Ray Houston, but he did not become governor. But Nevada has a long history of colorful politicians.
Only have about 500 on the list. My favorite, okay, I'm going to say my favorite oddball who I don't know anything about. So I had done the oral history of Ralph Denton, and Ralph was an attorney for a guy named Z. Louie. And Z. Louie was known as the mystery man of Nevada politics. He owned the Louisiana Club in West Las Vegas. He was Chinese, and he had this club in West Las Vegas. And Ralph once went back to Washington with me, or with Z. Louie, and told the story. They're headed along, and they hear, "Louie!" And Louie turns, "Hello, Senator Humphrey." "Hubert?" "Yeah." "Hello, Louie." "Oh, hello, Senator Russell." Whatever. And so he knew everybody. How did he know them? Nobody knows.
My question is for Jeff. The Mob Museum deals with a whole bunch of characters who often didn't save their files. I'm currently working to build an archive on an industry that doesn't like to talk about what they did before it was legal. And I was wondering if you had any tips for a fellow researcher on how to navigate those kinds of troubled waters.
Well, I only have a little advice, which is typically you're going to need to find ways to illustrate that story that are unconventional, right? So it's not going to be papers per se, or it's going to be objects that you might be able to obtain from individuals and other kinds of sort of representative objects. I think if we're talking about, this is how we do it. So you look for ways to illustrate a story in a way that you wouldn't probably do through a special collections or through a more conventional museum style. And it's very challenging because a lot of these objects are going to be in people's homes. So they're going to be, we talked the aforementioned attics and closets, and or they might be in the hands of collectors, or they might, and so sometimes collectors don't want to give up things without some money changing hands. It's a little bit of a different environment when you're dealing with stuff that isn't in sort of the mainstream. Is that helpful? Oh, okay.
The question about politicians had me flashing back to the first politician I was ever aware of when I was in elementary school, and that was our mayor, Orrin Gregson, who I believe was a 4-term mayor. And what I remembered about him, learning about him as a child, was first that he had a stutter, and then this image of him as a very mild-mannered man, and I met him later in life, very nice, mild-mannered. And he was our mayor during very formative years of our city. Very different personality from Ralph Lamb is certainly my impression. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about him, and how did he become mayor, and how did he become successful for 4 terms, and how did he affect the growth of our community?
That's you.
Oh, they want me. Orrin Gregson had come here from Arkansas, I believe, and I think he worked on the dam. And he had a furniture store. And the story is that his furniture store kept getting burgled. And the police couldn't seem to find anybody, so one night he camped at the furniture store. He had comfortable places to hang out, obviously. And he had his squirrely rifle or whatever. And the break-in occurred, and it was the police. So he decided to run for mayor to reform things. Well, he couldn't completely reform things. And he ran against a councilman who was one of the Bunker brothers. Wasn't supposed to be elected and was. And he was a big advocate of consolidation. And the metro consolidation is part of that. He was trying to do more with the city and county and just ran into all kinds of political problems. He also was very active in civil rights, despite, when he was running, accusations that he really was anti-civil rights. And the story is that he went door to door in West Las Vegas, and yes, he stuttered. This was difficult for him. But going door to door and saying, I know you didn't vote for me. You're going to see why you should have. And the NAACP has a Hall of Fame, and he's in it. He was active in downtown redevelopment, and I was being interviewed about this the other day. In the early 70s, to our consternation, the Union Pacific Depot was taken out, and the Union Plaza's built, and the new City Hall, which is now the old City Hall, were both built. And not all of these are great developments, but it's part of this problem he had to confront with suburbanization. How do you revitalize downtown? And he worked very hard at it.
And he was also a big believer in public works, which is why there's the highway that bears his name. He was very much responsible for that because there was already the I-15 had been part of the Interstate Highway Act, putting the freeway through Las Vegas, but he wanted to have a way to service the growing west side of the valley, and he was he pushed very hard to get that leg of the expressway, which is down the 95, built. And I did get a chance to speak with him a few years before he passed away, and that's what my story was about at the time. And that was his, he said at the time, maybe that's because I was asking him about, but he said that was one of his proudest accomplishments, was to put the freeway through.
And just so you know, we do have the Orrin Gregson papers in special collections and archives. It's a really rich, wonderful collection of material documenting especially his career in civil rights and as an advocate. And so, any other questions? Let's see.
Thank you very much. My name is Teresa. I'm new in Nevada. I'm a veteran. And last semester was my first semester, and I had to take a history class. And in that history class, I had the pleasure of having a wonderful history teacher, Ms. Flores, and she presented us with a book by Andrew Kirk. And of course, we had to do a research paper on the Nevada testing site. And I'm from Pennsylvania, came here from Texas, and I didn't even know, and that's a shame, that this place was such a place for atomic bomb dropping. And I wondered how much of that is still lingering around in the air. And I visited the testing, the museum. And do any of you know Andrew Kirk? And also, are any of those reporters still alive that were at Ground Zero, that were exposed to radiation therapy? And are we at risk?
Well, the people there definitely were at risk, who were there at the time, who worked there, and there was a lot of cases of leukemia that broke out in the years following that, and there was a lawsuit brought by a couple of local lawyers who I talked to him just recently. This lawsuit was from back in the 1970s and didn't get settled until 1992. And their clients were three women whose husbands had all passed away working at the test site with one test in particular that didn't vent the way it was supposed to. And they did not get the award they were seeking. And they were a little bit upset about that, but they said that their efforts helped to pass another bill which provided compensation for test site workers and workers at other areas that had contaminants in it. It was an act, I forget the name of it, passed in 1992. But definitely, the ruling did say that there were people there who had suffered damage from the testing, just that the government wasn't responsible.
It was the Bainbury test, and there's a recent book on it, and there are papers related to Bainbury in special collections. Judge Roger D. Foley heard the case, and the government's argument was you can't bring a case against us, whether national security, all of this, and he ruled, no, you can. The problem was that the widows could not prove that their husband's cancers definitely came from the test site. If you think of the movie The Conqueror, John Wayne as Genghis Khan, but it's filmed in southern Utah, a test went over, the cloud went over, almost everybody on the set got cancer, but almost everybody on the set was smoking cigarettes constantly. So then how do you prove these things? That's part of the problem. Since I work for Andy Kirk, he's my department chair, so I have to be nice to him. But I would be anyway. He has put out a book called Doom Towns. It is a graphic history of atomic testing with documents and artwork, and it is spectacular. And by the way, I should not tell this, for his 25th wedding anniversary, Andy went to the artist, and the artist drew a series of panels about the courtship and marriage. And I went into his office and I said, you've ruined it for every other husband who has to get an anniversary gift. But the book is wonderful.
Well, and I should mention, I think you're going to mention too, but if this topic interests you, I mean, you could spend the rest of your life researching it and writing about it. There's a lot there and a lot here, I believe.
And Ms. Flores may have sent you to the Nevada Test Site Oral History Project, which was partly special collections, partly the history and sociology departments. There was material that existed, there was material they added to, but it's just a wealth of information. And since then, Special Collections has gone on to do an African American experience, is doing a Jewish heritage project, and now I believe is moving into the Hispanic community. Thank you.
We have time for one more question? Okay.
Hi, I was wondering if you guys could just outline a really broad outline of the major eras of Las Vegas history, like maybe when people first started coming, the mob era, like something like that.
Can you do that in 30 seconds, Mike?
Yeah.
30 seconds, we're going for it. I would say going back, of course, with Native Americans long before, but in terms of Euro-American settlement, the last half of the 19th century, there about the ranch period, the first 30 years of the 20th century, the railroad period, then I would say you would look at the New Deal in World War II because it's the beginnings of gambling, but it's also the real beginning of the federal presence, or as Gene Moring calls it, the federal trigger, Hoover Dam, the New Deal, World War II. The post-war era, really up to the late 60s. And I say the late 60s because that's when you get the beginnings of the Southern Nevada Water Project, and you get corporate gaming beginning to come in. And I am afraid to try another era, but I'll say this. Sue Kim very kindly mentioned my textbook. I had to break it up somehow, and so I invented eras. And anyone who wants to argue, go right ahead.
I made just a quick note on this. I, for no particularly good reason, I made a rule that actually you have to start any discussion of Nevada history or Las Vegas history with the ichthyosaur, look it up, and the Columbian mammoth. So once you talk about those, then you can start talking about human beings.
And they're more interesting than most human beings.
So I want to thank everybody for coming out, and I want to thank my three wonderful panelists here, Tom, Mike, and Jeff. And there's a completely overused cliche that Las Vegas doesn't care about its history, but you can certainly see that that is not true when you see that these guys are out there working it all the time for us. So thanks so much for coming.